Now let's look at how to make our unit test use a mock database instead of the live database. Normally when we're writing a LINQ query, we start it with something like this. So using database equals new library context. And this library context thing is what determines what database it's going to connect to when translating the LINQ query. Let's actually just look at that quickly in Visual Studio. Let's look at the scaffolded models. So all of these classes here were generated by the scaffolder tool. So let's look at library context itself. Here's this method called onConfiguring, which says it takes in this options builder, but it basically says if the options builder is not configured, or in other words, if it's using the default options, then it does this, optionsbuilder.useMySQL. So that is exactly what is making all of our queries use MySQL. And then inside of there is the connection string pointing to the server and the database and the user ID and everything like that. So what we would need to do is somehow get this options builder to not use the default, and then it won't use MySQL. We'll tell it to use an in-memory database connector. So the connection string, as we just saw, is hard-coded to be using the live database. And what we want instead is something like this. We want to be able to create a library context that uses a mock database. And this isn't the real syntax or anything, this is just the basic idea. So our controller uses a different library context. It'll still have all of the exact same scaffolded classes. The only thing we want to change is that connection part. Don't use MySQL, use a mock database. So the way we would need to do this as is every controller would need to have something like this. If we're running unit tests, then make a library context with the mock database, else make a default library context that will go to the real server. But I have this crossed out. This is clearly this is bad design. Your controller should not know whether it's being tested or not. That is absolutely not a concern of the controller. The controller should just be a controller. So we need to rethink the way our controllers are written. Currently, they're all written like this. The first line in them is probably using new library context. So let me go to the all titles controller. This was the pseudocode. Let me actually go and look at just the first part of the actual solution. So there's more down below this, but here I am using library context equals a new library context. This will not facilitate mocking very easily because we would need to do something like this. If not testing, then we can use that library. I'll just kind of write pseudocode here. You would eventually close up that query and then do something like else. Then you would do using a library context with the mock database. But as we saw, that is not a concern of the controller. We should not have that if statement here. So what we need to do is for the entire home controller class, anytime a home controller is created, we want to be able to configure it to save one library context somewhere that's a member of the whole class, and then every controller can use it. And that one library context can be configured to either use the live database or the mock database. So that looks something like this. This is the home controller class. We make the library context a member of the class instead of declaring a new one for every query. And by default, we can just let it use the default connection. So just db equals new library context. And then when we're writing our controllers, we don't need to create one. We can just, from x in database dot whatever, we can just use db, which is already a member of the class. And we don't need a using block since we're not creating a new one. Since it is disposable, though, we will eventually have to clean it up, and we'll see that later. So then, what we can do is provide an option to change which library context we're using, so that by default, it will just do this. And if we want to, we can invoke this useContext method. So we would invoke that in a unit test. We would say, after creating the home controller, we want to use this other library context. So that's going to be our library context that is connected to the mock database instead of the live database. So all this method is doing is reassigning DB, which means all of the controllers will now automatically just use the other library context, and they don't even need to know that anything has changed. So let me look at the code, and I'll go to the very top. So it turns out I have actually already done that in this class. I have created a member of the home controller class. It's a library context called DB, and the constructor by default just uses new library context, which is going to go to the MySQL server. But if we want to change it, I've provided this method here. Use this other library context, and all it does is reassign that variable DB. Okay, and then when we want to write a query, so let me go back down to all titles. So this right here is actually just hiding the member variable called DB. So it turns out I don't actually even need this using block at all, and my query will still work. DB is defined as a member of the class, so I can just use it directly like that. But let's wrap up a couple of little questions that you may be having right now before going any further. Let me go back up to the top of this class and address a couple of issues. First of all, why do I have this useLibraryContext method instead of just passing in a library context into the constructor? Well, turns out the way that .NET web servers are set up, at least in this version that we're using, you can only have a default constructor. So I can't create another constructor that allows me to actually pass something in, so the workaround is to just make kind of like a setter method. This is essentially a setter, just telling the class to use a different context. I lied a little bit. You can actually make other constructors for a controller, but it's not as straightforward as you think, and it starts to get really messy, so we're just going to live with this workaround. The other question is, as I just showed down below in the controller, I got rid of the using block. Using is important, though. It's responsible for calling dispose on the library context. Library context is a disposable object. So since I've now created the library context as a member of the whole class, it still has to be disposed of at some point. So my controller is also disposable. So I can override my home controller's dispose method. So whenever it gets cleaned up by the web server, which it will, I can now just call database db.dispose. And db, again, is just the library context object for the whole controller class. So when I go back down to all titles, it's okay that I don't have this using block here. DB will be cleaned up once the entire controller object is done with it.